Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the San Antonio Book Festival 2021 edition, which, as you can see, is online this year. We're delighted to have three incredible authors here for Bird is the Word. And we're going to dive right into this in a moment, but first I just wanted to encourage everyone to consider purchasing the books of these authors, which I'll be holding up as we talk about them. You can buy them at the Nowhere Bookstore online and support an independent local bookstore that will also put the San Antonio Book Festival make the festival possible. So we really appreciate your being here. As you'll see over on the right side of your screen, there's a chat session. If you have any kind of questions, you can put them in the Q&A. If you have other issues, you can put it in the chat box, and we'll be paying attention to that. So let's dive right into this. So my name is Jonathan Meiburg, and I am the founder and director of the Texas Butterfly Ranch and the Monarch Butterfly and Pollinator Festival here in San Antonio. And as some of you from San Antonio know, and others may not, San Antonio was the first monarch butterfly collecting city in the country, declared by the National Wildlife Federation. And this year, we were declared a bird city in Texas as well. So we have that butterfly bird thing going on here. We've got the San Antonio River, incredible riparian restoration going on. So more birds and more butterflies is good for all of us, and we're going to be talking more and more about that today. So on to our panelists here. Let's start with Scott Weidensaul. Scott, is it Weidensaul or Wiedensaul?
Weidensaul, thanks for asking.
Scott is an award-winning author of nearly 30 books on natural history, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist Living on the Wind, as well as Return to Wild America, with Ghosts with Trembling Wings, and The First Frontier. Latest book, A World on the Wing, a global odyssey of migratory birds. This came out and just made the New York Times bestseller list this week. We're very proud of you, Scott. I think that deserves a round of applause, and of course, gives you the great acclaim that you so deserve. Weidensaul is a contributing editor for Audubon and writes for a variety of other publications and leads natural history tours around the world. He's an active field researcher into bird migration, studying snowy owls, wintering hummingbirds in the east, and birds migrating from Alaska, among other subjects. He and his wife live in New Hampshire. Next up, we've got Jonathan Meiburg, which is right up the road in Austin, Texas. In 1997, Meiburg received a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship and traveled to remote communities around the world, a year-long journey that sparked his enduring fascination with islands, birds, and the history of the living world. Since then, he's written reviews, features, and interviews for print and online publications, including The Believer, The Talk House, and The Appendix, on subjects ranging from a hidden exhibit hall at the American Museum of Natural History to the last long-form interview with author Peter Mathiasson. His debut book is titled A Most Remarkable Creature, The Hidden Life and Epic Journey of the World's Smartest Birds of Prey, the Caracara species. But he's best known as the leader of the band Shearwater, whose albums and performances have been often praised by NPR, the New York Times, The Guardian, and Pitchfork. Welcome, Jonathan.
Great to be here.
Good. And now on to J. Drew Lantham. J. Drew Lantham is the author of The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature. He's a birder, naturalist, conservationist, and an alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology and master teacher at Clemson University. His latest book, titled Sparrow Envy, Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts. He lives in Seneca, South Carolina. So now that we know who all of you are, I just want to quickly hold up the books. This is Scott's book, World on the Wing. J. Drew Lantham's book, Sparrow Envy, and The Most Remarkable Creature, The Caracara, by Jonathan Meiburg. So I thought it would be interesting for us to start with the more broad topic of migration, since Scott, that is what your book's about, and frankly, each of these books touch on that in some form or fashion, and I'm very curious why birders are so enraptured with birds that migrate versus birds that are just in the neighborhood. I consider myself an incidental birder, but I think that's a good question to start with. What is it about migration that's so captivating?
Well, I mean, from a birder's perspective, the thing is that migration brings you a constantly changing cast of characters throughout the entire year. I mean, you're almost no matter where you live, especially in North America, the whole world, at least the whole Western Hemisphere, is passing through your backyard a couple of times a year. I live in, as you said, in New Hampshire, and right now there are birds that spent the winter in southern South America, in Central America, in the Caribbean, in parts of Mexico or the southeastern U.S., including birds that spent part of the winter in Texas, heading to my backyard. And that's a really exciting thing. So look, birders love the birds that are around all the time, but we like variety. We're human that way. Also, migratory birds just do astonishing things. The distances they travel, the physical, feats of physical endurance that they're able to perform. Little tiny sandpipers that are 6 inches long and weigh barely an ounce that fly 3,300 miles nonstop for 4 or 5 days across the Western Atlantic. The equivalent of running 126 consecutive marathons without food, water, or rest. And that's just kind of run of the mill for migratory birds.
Tell us about some of the interesting facts in your book about what birds physically go through when they migrate, like the physiological changes in their bodies that occur that just seem almost like superhuman is probably not the right word, but just like impossible to fathom how they transform their bodies and utilize different parts of their physical matter.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things, and a lot of these are aspects of bird physiology that human physiologists would really love to understand and figure out how to replicate in people. Like, for example, the fact that birds coming into migratory condition can dramatically increase their muscle mass and do it without exercise. I would very much like to be able to do that. Thank you very much. They can kind of flip a switch between laying on fat and laying on muscle tissue. There's one remarkable migrant, a bird called the bar-tailed godwit. It's about the size of a small duck. It's a shorebird with a really long skinny bill and long legs, and it flies nonstop from Western Alaska across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean to New Zealand and Australia for the winter. It takes up to 11 days of continuous flight to make that trip. And in order to do that, first of all, they more than double their weight in the matter of a couple of weeks feeding in Alaska. And then when they no longer need their digestive system, they get rid of it. Their stomach, their intestines, their kidneys all atrophy dramatically over a matter of just a couple of days. Then they take off. They make this 7,200-mile nonstop flight, land in New Zealand, regrow their guts, spend the austral summer down there feeding, go through the same thing, fly up to China and the Koreas in the spring, regrow their guts, feed, guts shrink down. They do this repeatedly throughout the year over a lifespan that might take 25 or 30 years. So that kind of yo-yo dieting in a human would kill us, but it doesn't seem to bother the birds at all.
Yeah, if we could patent that gut shrinking thing, boy, we could make a lot of money together. It's a recent discovery, and how did they figure this out? I mean, it seems like a very challenging prospect to sort of, understand that a bird's gut is shrinking and when it happens.
Well, in that case, it was completely by accident. A bunch of bar-tailed godwits that were, taking off on their southbound migration in Cold Bay, Alaska, which is a cold, foggy place because I've been to Cold Bay. And in the fog, they flew into the side of one of these giant radar domes. It looks like a giant golf ball, and broke their necks. And the scientists that were studying them necropsied them, opened them up, and they're like, where'd the guts go? Oh, this must be a freak bird. And they did the next one, and it was the same thing. And they realized that this is typical for these birds. But a lot of these new discoveries have to do with new technology. For example, in 2013 in Switzerland, a group of scientists that were studying alpine swifts, similar to the chimney swifts or Vox's swifts that we have in North America, but much larger. They were curious about where these birds went for the winter. And so they put tiny little data loggers on their backs that would record where the birds went, but also had a little accelerometer in it so that you could tell how much of the time the bird was spent flying and how much of the time the bird was spending sitting. The birds flew off to Africa for the winter. They came back to Switzerland the next year. They downloaded the data, and they discovered these birds don't land for like 6 months during migration and their wintering time in Africa. And we found out since then that other species of old world swifts, like common swifts, can spend up to 10 months in continuous flight, feeding on the wing, sleeping on the wing. Basically, if they didn't have to lay an egg in a nest, they would never, ever land. They're totally aerial creatures.
Amazing. So Jonathan and Drew, as serious birders, is this the kind of information that you just sort of have tucked in your pocket and you know all this stuff, or is this new to you? Drew, what do you think?
Well, some of it. Scott has unusually large pockets, so he's able to I mean, to pack so much of this stuff in. I've used his books as texts for my class, to help people understand, the super nature of birds, and migration is such a spectacle for all of us. And considering these things that all birds can do in some sort of ways, but when you have a single bird, some warbler or tanager or thrush, that shows up in your backyard, as Scott says, and you reduce millions of years of evolution and then the trials down to that single week or single weeks of that bird having jumped off one night from the Yucatan Peninsula to cross the Gulf of Mexico, and then all the gauntlet of adversity that it's had to face, and then it's there. So it makes you want to warn, to understand, as I say, not just what birds are, but who birds are.
Kind of sounds like the butterfly.
Tuck it in. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Jonathan, what do you say? I mean, are you familiar with all of these facts about bird migration? Is this like something that birders, just sort of know offhand, or was that news?
Well, there's so much to learn about birds that there's always something new. I don't think anybody could fit the whole picture in their heads. One thing that actually I did ask, though I do know about the study that first confirmed the Bartail-Godwit migration. I wanted to ask Scott a question about that. I remember seeing that the track of those birds, and that some of them went straight from the Gulf of Alaska to New Zealand, but some of them turned hard right and went to New Guinea. How did they know to do that?
So migration is a genetically coded instinct, right? And so just depending on what genes you inherited from your parents, you're going to have a slightly different genetic orientation when you're heading south. And, and actually some of them are going to be born with a genetic orientation. It's going to take them out into the middle of the Pacific Ocean where there's nothing, and they're out of the gene pool. But, in terms of like how they know when it's time to make that turn, it looks like they're using just a time distance program. They're programmed to fly in a certain direction for a certain length of time for a certain number of nights or days, and then something flips in their brain and whoop, we're going to turn this way. And you can do the same thing in a sense when you're running an orienteering course with map and compass. You don't know where you're going to end up, but if you follow the directions, walk a certain number of paces in this direction, and then turn to a different heading and walk a certain number of paces in that direction, you can come to a predetermined spot. And in a sense, that's kind of what migratory birds are doing.
You think about, if we think about birds navigating by the stars sometimes, which some of them certainly do, but for a bird like that, it's got to keep both hemispheres' stars in its head if it's going to use them.
Well, and also, it's using the Earth's magnetic field, which we've just discovered really within the last few years exactly how birds are using, and it's something involving quantum physics, which is just mind-blowing. They're using, during daytime, they're using the position and movement of polarized light across the sky, so they have all of these different orientation cues. Some birds, especially seabirds, can actually smell their way back home across thousands of miles. So I suspect a godwit making that flight. And by the way, the young godwit making that flight across the Pacific for the first time is doing it entirely on its own. Mom and dad aren't with it. But it's pulling on, as Drew said, millions of years of evolution and just really savage natural selection. It's, the birds that make these flights are the best of the best of the best of the best, generation after generation.
So Scott, I want to ask about that, and you and I talked about this before. You said that migration is genetically determined. So does that mean, we often think migration is birds leaving because they need shelter, food, a place to reproduce, all of that. So you're saying that that's really not what's going on. It's just this like timing thing that they were born with, and they're physically different from birds that don't migrate?
Right. So, I guess the point I was trying to make is that the birds are not taught to migrate. And for most migratory birds, they're not learning a specific route and specific stopover sites and specific wintering sites. There's some exceptions to that. Waterfowl and cranes, there is a lot of multi-generational migration where young birds will learn specific routes from older birds. That's why we can train whooping cranes to follow an ultralight south from Wisconsin to create a new wintering area in Florida, because they learn that route once and then they do it the rest of their life. But most birds, they come out of the egg with this genetically coded set of instructions to fly at a certain time of the year in a certain direction that's triggered by the changing ratio of daylight and darkness. It's triggered by their own internal circadian rhythms, and but they're operating off this genetic map. They don't know where they're going the first time. They just know they've got to go that way, and if they're lucky and if they're successful, they'll find a wintering place. They'll fly back to their breeding territory the next year and just continue to go back and forth. They'll refine the trip as they do that year after year and get better at it. But the first time, it's almost always entirely by instinct.
Is there a way to decipher, for example, creatures or birds in particular that migrate versus not migrating? Is one stronger, better, more resilient than the other, or is it just different kinds of genetic wisdom that are imparted whether they migrate or not?
Different kind of resiliency. I mean, a willow ptarmigan that's wintering north of the Arctic Circle, that's a different kind of resiliency and a different kind of toughness than a bird that's migrating from above the Arctic Circle down to southern South America. Both ways of living have their own inherent risks, have their own inherent advantages. Life for a bird in a tropical rainforest is not a piece of cake. I mean, they've got far more parasites and predators and pests. Their nest survival of their chicks is much, much lower in the tropics compared to a bird breeding in, the forests of North America or Europe. So, it's everything in nature is a trade-off, and that's the case there as well. That's something I'm sure Drew can speak to with some authority as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, that whole barter, I like to think of it as a barter adaptation, and where birds sort of end up on the spectrum of how they make a living. So Scott mentioned, he mentioned waterfowl, and we talk about these obligatory migration strategies versus facultative. And so, you look at waterfowl and they're facultative, and duck hunters, for example, can tell you that these birds are short stopping, that they're not coming as far south because they don't need to. There's open water where they are, there's food that's available, habitat, and the like, but it's also a clue, for example, of what's going on with climate change. So, the wonder of birds, as Jonathan said, is that we are constantly learning more. And then part of the wonder to me as a writer and a scientist, and this is sort of an intersection, is all that we can know, but the amazing amount that we will likely never know, that we won't be able to explain, but that we can continue to ask these about how birds do what birds do, or migratory strategies for birds like Carolina wrens that are short distance migrants, but in a relatively short period of time have expanded their range because of milder winters, but then a hard winter comes and those birds are sort of knocked back. Or some of these Eurasian birds, blackcaps and the like, that are changing within generations. And so the Grants, with their work with finches, we think of evolution in millions of years, but really it occurs sometimes rapidly. And so birds, with all of these physiological abilities that they have evolved, are really sort of emblematic of resilience if we give them a chance, if we don't outpace with our disturbances what they are able to do. So that's part of what I find fascinating about the whole thing, the remarkable birds that Jonathan talks about, and these caracaras and their intelligence, and again, just these super traits that we look skyward and envy. And you got to think, that for as long as hominids have been looking up and thinking, beyond themselves, we've been wondering how birds do what birds do, right? I mean, we're just great apes. So, us, our ancestors looking up, seeing birds doing what birds do, those that we weren't catching and eating, that those birds, that they were aspirational in some sort of way. So the science brings that knowledge that says, wow, yeah, if I could just pack on muscle like that, or find the good fat and use it, or not use my GPS to have me drive into the middle of a lake, then that would be an awesome thing. But birds give us that daily in our backyards, and we can watch it and see it.
Well, I just want to do one more quick question here. Maybe not quick, but and then we're going to talk to Jonathan about the caracara, which is also an incredible migrating creature. But I know we're not supposed to compare nature to us, but you know, of course, it's all about us. And I'm just curious.
Why not?
In the age of the Anthropocene, are there comparisons to humanity for the non-scientist, non-professional migration studies person? I mean, we look at migration and immigration, especially where we live in Texas, here in San Antonio, Texas, everything that we're witnessing at this moment in time. And you think, why do people migrate? Because to have a better life, you know, the whole American dream. And it's hard not to project that onto birds, why birds migrate. But Scott, you've blown my theory in telling me that it's all genetic and has nothing to do with, you know, building a better life for future generations. And I'm just curious, what are the applications here in the science of migration versus what we, you know, casually observe as just regular citizens?
So I think it's important, first of all, to recognize that when we use the word migration with birds and with people, it's two different things. Because
Sure.
with birds and with animals in general, including most butterflies, you know, I think about monarch butterflies, it's a return migration. They're going to a place and coming back, and it's an annual back and forth. Whereas with human migration, that's usually an emigration. It's usually people moving more or less permanently into new places. But you know, migratory organisms do this as well. Drew mentioned blackcaps in Europe, which are an old world warbler, have evolved a new migration route and a new wintering area. We're seeing the same thing happening in eastern North America with a whole bunch of species of western hummingbirds, especially rufous hummingbirds. And it's because migration is genetically coded. Anything that's genetic is subject to mutation, and you'll get, you know, rufous hummingbirds, which instead of migrating as they traditionally did from the Pacific Northwest straight down into the mountains of Mexico, they make a hard left and they wind up in New Hampshire or Pennsylvania or Virginia in October or November. And, you know, 300-400 years ago, the climate was colder and the landscape was different, and those birds would have been culled out of the population. They would have been out of the gene pool. But we have changed the circumstances. And what I often say that, you know, nature's continually throwing spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. You know, it's constantly throwing out this incredible jumbled mix of genetic mutations in every population at every generation, and almost all of those mutations are deleterious. They're bad for the animals, except when conditions change, and then all of a sudden, what had been bad becomes good. And so rufous hummingbirds, now tens of thousands of them, are wintering in the east and particularly in the southeast every year. And they've just developed within the last 50 years a brand new migratory route and wintering area.
But on a much larger scale, though, I mean, every bird that we see is the product of a great migration, a great emigration, because birds are the dinosaurs who lived through the Cretaceous extinctions, which were really terrible, especially in the northern hemisphere. It now appears that more and more that the southern hemisphere may not have suffered quite as much, and in fact that may have been the reservoir where the dinosaurs that survived lived and spread from there into the rest of the world. Now there are many birds that probably came from Antarctica and moved into South America, into Africa, into Australasia, into the rest of the world. Now they can't go back to Antarctica now, but if they could, they would. But they come from there. They're exiled from there. And this is part of the argument I'm making about caracaras, is that falcons and their closest relatives, which are parrots, not hawks or eagles, probably came up from Antarctica into South America, diversified there. And the birds that we know commonly in the northern world as falcons are actually one tiny offshoot of that family that sort of took root in the northern hemisphere and spread around it. Relatively recently in geological terms. So there's bird migration, but there is also bird emigration. And of the sort of 10,000 or so bird species that outnumber mammals by quite a lot, by the way, that we have today, I mean, you might say we're still living in the golden age of the dinosaurs. Only about 900 species of dinosaurs have ever been described from before the Cretaceous extinctions. Now we have 10,000.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. That's actually a really good segue to talk about your book, A Most Remarkable Creature, the caracara. I want you to tell our folks in the audience what is it about the caracara that so seduced you? And I want you to talk about Tina, Polly, and Sirius also.
Okay. Well, first of all, I should establish what caracaras are. They're a group of falcons. They're a subgroup of the falcon family, and the greatest diversity of falcons today is still found in South America, probably the first place where they became themselves. The birds like the peregrine, the kestrel, the merlin, these familiar falcons of the northern world, are sometimes called true falcons, although it's sort of a strange misnomer, I think, because it's not as if the other ones are false. And in fact, they're ancestral. I mean, they're an earlier diverging lineage within that family. And these birds that are found in South America include some very mysterious birds we don't know hardly anything about called forest falcons, which live in tropical forests. Weirdos like the laughing falcon, which eats snakes, and then the caracaras. And the caracaras, one clue to understanding what they are is to know that South America has no crows. It has no big black crows. There are some jays that live in the tropics, which are related to crows, but there's nothing like the crows of the northern world that we think of in the genus Corvus. Instead, it's almost like they have these, as if you built a crow sort of on a falcon chassis. So you have a bird of prey that's very clever, very social, very innovative, scavenging, omnivore, curious. One of them's figured out how to eat nothing but wasps' nests in the tropical forests. They are just so far outside the realm of what we normally think of when we think of birds of prey, that they've actually sometimes been kind of pushed over to the side by people who like to think about birds of prey because they're not good raptors. They're bad falcons. And the species that I met first was in the Falkland Islands, and it's an incredible species called striated caracaras, they look sort of like a cross between a hawk and a crow. And they astonished Darwin when he met them in 1833, not least because they stole things from the crew of the Beagle. They took hats, they took compasses, they took a pair of these sort of heavy bolas that they used to catch cattle in the Falklands at that time. And he just couldn't make heads or tails of these birds. He didn't know why they were like this. He didn't know why they seemed to be only in the Falklands, and rather rare. But what would be keeping them in this very, very isolated place? The Falklands are off the southeast coast of South America, right down near Tierra del Fuego, the very southern tip, just off to the east in the Atlantic Ocean. And this question had remained. And so my book sort of takes that as a MacGuffin and says, well, okay, what are these birds doing here? Why are they like this? Why are there so few of them? And looking into that question was what led me into this much larger world of trying to talk about this group, reveal some of the marvelous things about them, and my own astonishment at how little we knew, even about it within the scientific world, about what's a very flashy and easy to see, very often very common group of birds. Now, you asked about Tina and Evita. Tina is was a captive striated caracara who lived in England, who was able to perform some really astonishing feats in falconry displays that were unlike anything that most birds of prey seem inclined or even able to do. She could fetch stuffed animals by name. Her keeper could throw a group of stuffed animals behind his head and say, "Go get Nemo," and she would jump down and go get Nemo and come back and put it in a plastic bucket. And she could also tell objects apart by shape and by color. These are the kinds of things that we've asked parrots to do experimentally, or some crows, but caracaras haven't been scientifically investigated behaviorally at all yet. Polly, you asked about Polly, right?
Yes.
But Polly was a parrot who was met by the sort of hero of my book, who was a naturalist named William Henry Hudson, who was born in Argentina in the 1840s, about 10 years after Darwin passed through there. And he moved to England when he was about 30, and eventually, after many hard years, became known as a novelist, a writer about nature, a writer particularly about the natural world that he knew as a child, which actually drew reading Home Place. I thought again and again about Hudson's description of his childhood in Argentina in books like Far Away and Long Ago, because it has the same sort of sensual and meditative quality as your writing does, and not just what was there, but what it meant to him, and the significance of it, the feelings associated with it, what he called his own animism, and which was a feeling that he shared with few other people in that he knew as a child. But he met this bird, Polly, who was a yellow-fronted Amazon parrot in England. And Polly was interesting because to Hudson, because Hudson often didn't like meeting pet parrots, which were a fairly common feature of Victorian England. But Polly had been bought in Mexico in something like 50 years earlier. And when Polly had first arrived in England, she spoke Spanish. She sang songs in Spanish. She would respond to Spanish words. But over time, Polly began to speak English. And Hudson had a hard time making friends with this bird, but he started speaking Spanish to her, and they became friends after that. Now, she didn't respond in Spanish, but his sense was that she was, in his words, she was conscious of a past and trying to recall it. And Hudson was very much ahead of his time in thinking about birds' minds and the capabilities and capacities of birds' minds at a time when people thought of them as almost automatons. He saw individuals. He saw individuals with thought and feeling, aesthetics, characteristics that we thought of for a long time as sort of exclusively human. And but even though Polly was a parrot and not a caracara, these are the same kinds of qualities that you also see, I think, in the caracaras, and the more closely people look at them, the more of this I think we're likely to see.
Yeah, I thought that it was such a revealing story to me about the fact that a bird could have a memory of a language and have it sort of reawakened. And I think if I'm not mistaken, the bird lived to be 51, correct?
Well, Polly was done in by pub meals Polly lived in an inn called the Lamb in the South Wiltshire Downs in England, and she would sit at the table and eat with the guests and the family who owned the inn, whatever they ate. She ate meat. She loved to hold like a leg of lamb in one foot and kind of eat it like this, which actually speaks to parrots' common ancestry with falcons. Because we think of parrots as vegetarians, but most parrots offered meat will eat it, and some still seek it out in the wild, like those kias in New Zealand, which are these alpine, very, very interesting alpine parrots. But I'm wandering off here. What was your question again?
I was just saying, what I really enjoyed about your book was the anecdotes like that give you this deeper insight into the path of the bird's intelligence, like
right. The thing, this is sorry, go ahead.
Sort of then cozy up to someone who suddenly speaks Spanish and sit on his shoulder. It's like, wow, who would have thought? It's amazing.
Well, I mean, and of course, these are just anecdotes. We don't know exactly what's going on there. But one thing that we can say is that the last time we had a common ancestor with a bird was about 300 million years ago, when we were amniotes, sort of amphibian-like things that lived in swamps and laid eggs. Basically, since that time, humans and birds have been on separate evolutionary trajectories, which means you can basically add our journeys together and get not 300 million years, but 600 million years of evolutionary time that separates us. And yet, despite that, we're able to forge a connection that's that close that we can speak to each other, sometimes in our language, that we can have an emotional connection, and that birds also, in their bird brains, are different from ours, both in form, but not necessarily so much in function. They actually evolved their own forebrain out of a different structure in their brain than ours did, and yet it seems to perform some of the same functions. They process their experiences through dreaming. They have a sense of self, of being able to project that self forward and backward in time. Different birds seem to be, greater or lesser in these degrees, but it's all there. And that connection, even over such a vast distance, it's absolutely fascinating to me.
Okay, so Jonathan, how do we know that birds dream? Come on.
Well, because they put crows in MRIs. Yeah, I think that's some research that, I don't know if John Marsloff was the supervisor on that research or not, but I think it was at the University of Washington, where they studied sleeping crows to see what they did and the electrical pathways that were lit up while they were sleeping. And they found that crows were basically using their amygdala in the way that we do when they were sleeping, in a way that suggested they were dreaming.
Cool. Well, just to veer off quickly in another direction, you're a professional musician.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious, first of all, do you have a particular song that sort of represents the you? Because I know a lot of your
No.
band water is named after a bird. Is that not true? Or
That's right. Shearwaters are a type of seabird who spend. I mean, they're kind of auspicious for a musician actually, because they travel all the time, and they live a very long time, and they're in our world but not quite of it in some ways, because most people living on land don't see them, yet they're very numerous, and they live in a different version of our world than the one that we experience mostly. That sounds a lot like traveling musicians to me.
Yeah. Would you say that birds were the first musicians? Do you think music was inspired by birdsong?
Certainly, I don't know how much is known about mirror neurons in humans, the idea that there are these cells that induce mimicry in us of other sounds, but it's something we really like to do. And it seems, likely as not that our ancestors enjoyed mimicking natural sounds, and that, birds might have been some of the first sounds that we enjoyed and liked to replicate.
And if you can maybe just quickly touch on for the non-birders, because I know when I first learned this 15 years ago, I was flabbergasted at how important the song of the bird is used in bird identification. I had no idea that every bird had its song.
That species have different voices, that each species has its own voice.
Yes.
There's actually debate among some ornithologists about whether it might be possible to separate some species not by plumage. Like there might be separate species that look identical to us, but that actually simply just speak have a different dialect from one another, and whether that's enough to isolate them from each other. This is something we see like in the Amazon basin, where there are so many species of birds all packed in. But birds' voices are more than just song. I mean, there's a large group of birds we call songbirds that sing, that have these. But almost every bird has a voice, whether it has what gets called a song in songbirds or not. And caracaras, for instance, don't do what you might call singing, but they definitely are vocal. Crested caracaras, for instance, have a really striking sound that some people have compared to dragging a stick across the top of a picket fence, like that. And then red-throated caracaras, which are a tropical species that lives in tropical forests and eats wasps' nests, which I mentioned, they have such a wide vocabulary that it almost seems like they've invented a language of some kind. Being around them is very striking. They cluck and coo and scream to each other. It's not the sweet twittering of birds that you think of, but it's when you think about dinosaurs and the sounds that they must have made, maybe it was sort of more along these lines.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So, Drew, we're going to move on now to your book, Sparrow Envy. And my first question for you is also one that someone in the audience, Tom Inglet, posed, is why sparrow envy? Why not painted bunting envy or character envy or greater blue heron envy? Why sparrow envy versus another type of bird?
Thank you, Monica. Well, it's because so many birders for lots of years, I would hear some birders and bird watchers refer to sparrows as little brown birds, or LBJs, little brown jobs. And so all of those birds were sort of crushed together as unidentifiable, certainly not as spectacular to some as a painted bunting or a goldfinch or a northern cardinal. But, I mean, given just a little bit of patience to sit and watch sparrows and to recognize the amazing diversity in them, that they are not all the same. And so I wanted to, they sort of embody who I am as a Black man, as a person of color, to take the time to separate, to take the time to parse apart the superficially same for difference. So, it's sparrow envy is all about, it's a work of empathy, or at least an attempt at it. It's blurring lines. And for birders who are obsessive about identifying things, I think just sort of crushing everything into the same little brown job deal was not giving full credit to who sparrows, to who and what those birds are. And so that's part of it. And then I'm a skulker, right? I spend a lot of time a skulker. It's a bird that spends its time in these sort of out of the way, brambly, thickety places that most of us don't want to go. So personality wise, they fit. They fit from the standpoint of needing to be recognized as individuals.
No such
Did you-
thing as trash birds.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Scott.
I just said no such thing as trash birds.
Right.
Did you want to read the poem? It's a really short one. Would you like to read it to us real quick?
So you wanted me to read Sparrowimby?
Sure.
All right. Let's see here. Well, it's here we go. Sparrowimby. Were I the sparrow, brown-backed, skittish, and small, I would find haven in thorniest thickets, search far and wide for fields lain fallow, treasure the unkempt, worship the unmown, covet the weed-strewn row. I would slink between sedges, chip unseen from brambles, skulk deep within hedges, and desire the ditches grown wild. I would find great joy in the mist-sodden morning, sing humble pleas from the highest weeds, and plead for the gray days to stay. So there's a lot to envy from my standpoint of, the white-throated sparrows that are still in the backyard singing their songs, and the occasional white-crowned sparrow that makes its way here, and chipping sparrows that are in the pines all year round. All of those birds are so unique as to elicit a different sort of admiration. But as Scott said, there are no trash birds. My favorite bird is the one with feathers. So there's that.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say I have to speak up for caracaras here. William Henry Hudson, whom I mentioned, was one of the first writers to talk about caracaras in a sympathetic way. Even Darwin called them false eagles who ill become so high a rank. And Hudson said, a bird, he was talking about one species called Chimango caracaras. He said, a bird so cosmopolitan in its habits would have a whole volume to itself in England. Being only a poor foreigner, it has had no more than a few unfriendly paragraphs bestowed upon it.
Wonderful.
So there's birds as what they are, what they actually are, and then there's birds and what they mean to us, and those two things can be very, very different.
Yeah.
And so many of those. I'm sorry, Monica. So many of those attitudes we have about birds, Jonathan, of course, have nothing to do with the biology of the bird. They're assumptions based on the way the bird looks, what we think the bird eats, the fact that Chimango caracaras occasionally will eat a leather shoe. That's obviously they're not as noble as an eagle, except eagles eat all kinds of crap too.
So, Drew, you have a poem in your book called The Octoroon Warbler. I'd really like to talk about the process of writing that poem and what has been the reaction to it. And I also think it would be helpful for those unaware to explain what an octoroon is, because I don't think everyone knows what that means.
Well, first of all, an octoroon is, I guess you could call it an archaic term that comes mostly out of Louisiana and that region, but miscegenation, which is the mixing of the races, as it's been defined, would have someone be mulatto who was half black and half white. Quadroon would be quarter black blood. Octoroon would be a grandparent, right? So for the sake of naming birds and thinking about who birds are and how they're perceived by human beings, there's this question of John James Audubon's identity, right? that is being bandied about. And so as we think about bird names, as we think about defining what they are, as the AOS gets together and decides on names, and we're having these discussions about naming birds after people, these honorifics, we have to think about this identity from the human point of view. I want us to think about it from the bird's point of view. And so I like to bring together these sort of social constructs of race, right? And a lot of people don't realize, I mean, legally, one drop of black blood could condemn you to being subhuman. As long as you could hide it by outward appearance, you were okay. And so ancestry and lineage and how we think about it as humans and how we think about our field marks of skin hue, of ethnicity, and how we define birds all came into that poem. So, you know, I hope it rankles some feathers, really. You know, I hope it causes people to think about how we think about naming things. And it's an important conversation. I mean, scientific convention would often have birds or any other critter named after those who discovered it, or some person that a buddy says, you know, Bonaparte, I'm going to name this gull after you because we're buddies, or Bachman, Reverend Bachman, I'm going to name this bird after you because we are buddies, or you saw it or described it first. So I just wanted to create sort of this thinking palette for us to go beyond the traditional and to move also into, again, sort of blurring these lines between human social condition and ecology. So I'm a line blurrer, which can be a little problematic sometimes.
So you referenced the AOS,
Yeah.
the American Ornithological Society. What's
Right.
going on there with this conversation? I know, Scott, you had mentioned that there were discussions as well, and I don't know if you guys want to chime in on this, but what is the general perception of this line of thought in the professional and you know, niche organizations?
Well, you know, I go back to Scott's book of a feather, which was the first book, one of the first books that I use as a text, because it so beautifully brings in this idea of the confluence of history and ornithology. But I think this present discussion that in large part came about because of the Black Lives Matter movement and the horrific things that we were seeing in high def in Minnesota or in Louisville and other places. I think this is a particular moment in history where technology and social media and this country's reckoning with race are falling into a very different place. So I don't think that formerly the AOU or any ornithological organizations have really dealt seriously with this. Now, it's not that it hasn't come up. These issues have come up with some of these with some of these birds, but now there is a momentum, and we all know the AOS is thinking about these things seriously. So as people get together, it involves us doing things that we haven't done in the past to dig more deeply into who human beings were or are, and whether or not we should continue this. I know it's drifting a little bit outside of ornithology as well, and thinking about who the people are that birds or beetles or butterflies have been named for. So again, it causes us not to think about not projecting us onto these creatures. It's as Jonathan said, I mean, you know, we want to be close to these creatures, but thinking of the millions of years that are between us, the hundreds of millions of years that are between us, evolutionarily speaking, to reduce them to only who or what we know. I mean, that's part of science, but to imagine beyond that, I think is important. So, you know, I've been somewhat involved in some of this name game as I like. personally like pinewood sparrow better for the back. It describes that bird better. You know, if you're gonna name a bird after someone from the Lewis and Clark expedition, you know, I kind of like Clark's crow. I mean, you know, York's crow rather for Clark's nutcracker. You know, here is a black man who had a lot of responsibility for the Corps of Discovery getting west, or Sacagawea, and the assistance that she gave. So Lewis's woodpecker, that gorgeous bird, becomes Sacagawea's woodpecker, if you've got to name birds after people. But I think we can be more thoughtful and give the birds credit for, again, what and who it is that they are. So that's part of the exercise, I think, and just this expansion of how we think.
This is part of the beauty of scientific names. Because they're Latin, a language spoken by basically no one outside the Vatican, there aren't Romans walking around sort of laying claims to things. They're basically almost nonsense words. They might have a meaning, but it's not important to what they are. They're simply an identifying marker for the species. And they were created as a way for people to know they were talking about the same organisms. You know, birds don't care what you call them. But to name a thing is to control the thing in some way. And so I think I don't entirely understand why English names for birds and not many other organisms are standardized. That in itself seems like sort of an assertion of ownership that seems sort of unnecessary to me if we already have scientific names for these things. But, you know, naming is a human phenomenon. If it creates problems, they're human problems. And if they're human problems, then they can be solved by human actions.
And some of those actions have been taken. I mean, just last year, the AOS, on kind of an emergency basis, changed the name of McCown's longspur, which was named for an ornithologist who later became a Confederate general, and changed it to thick-billed longspur, just because, you know, we were tearing down Confederate monuments. Why would we have a Confederate bird?
And the bird definitely was not a Confederate bird. It was not in favor of the Confederacy.
No,
yeah, McCown was also a grave robber, right?
Yeah, and so was Townsend. We have Townsend
Townsend,
solitaire,
yes.
Townsend's warbler. The same year he was collecting bird specimens in the Pacific Northwest in the 1830s, he was also robbing native graves and decapitating skeletons and sending the skulls back to the East Coast. So some really problematic behavior on the parts of some of the people that these birds are named for.
Great. Well, guys, we're going to move into question and answer mode here. I think everybody's gotten a lot out of the session so far. But let's go to some of the questions that we're getting. Catherine Flato would like to know, Jonathan, if you could share your favorite birding experience with Peter Mathiasen.
Oh, I never birded with Peter. I only met him one time to do an interview with him, which was published in The Believer. But it was an extraordinary experience to get to meet him. And his books about birds, especially that book, The Wind Birds, or sometimes called The Shorebirds of North America, is extraordinary on birds. He wrote a beautiful book about cranes. He was a very thoughtful and astute and wonderful describer of wildlife, wild people, wild landscapes. So unfortunately, I don't have an experience to offer with birding with Peter. I never got to do it.
Okay. Sally McGee would like to know if anybody would like to comment on the fact that people have had spiritual experiences with birds throughout history, and that you guys have mentioned. Would anybody like to comment on that? How birds bring spirituality to us?
Well, I think one thing that we just have to bear in mind is that this is usually very much a one-way street. We experience these spiritual experiences with birds because, as Drew said before, you know, I think all of us to some extent have bird envy. You know, I love birds; they don't love me back. It's very much a one-way street there. The Now, there are times, and Jonathan touched on this, where you can create a connection between one individual person and one individual bird. And we consistently underestimate the mental, emotional, physiological abilities of birds, including the abilities to make these connections. But birds as a whole and people as a whole, they're usually living in their own spheres, and the ways we feel about the birds are not necessarily reciprocated.
I think about my grandmother who had these sort of different pigeonholes, as it were, for birds. For example, for owls, any owl was bad omen for her, and so. But I learned early on to imitate barred owls, for example. But it was something that she did not want me to do. Now, where did that come from for her? That came from enslaved ancestors, West African ancestors, but also likely from Native American ancestors. But we see sort of this owl as bad omen kind of mythology that runs across cultures, many of the world's cultures. But that comes down to me now. Before I will do barred owl calls, I take just a split second that most people would never recognize to ask my grandmother's permission for that. Because it's important for me. I don't see owls as bad omen, but it's a portion of my culture. It's almost like a land acknowledgement. It's this ancestral acknowledgement. So I like to say that aspiration is at least some first step to spirituality, I would suppose, sort of this desire to be above whatever realm it is that you are. And so maybe you're bound, maybe your hell is gravity, so to speak, and to rise above that. Certainly the poet, the preacher has always recognized that, but I think about ancestors who were enslaved, seeing birds flying over them and those birds. Or again, Harriet Tubman using barred owl calls to help people understand where she was. And so all of those things to me bring us to a point of maybe birds not loving us, but us seeing in birds something greater in some sort of way than ourselves. Most of us as kids tried to fly and it didn't work, right? We have broken bones to prove it. And so that's where I sort of go with it. And I certainly appreciate in other cultures the depth of meaning that birds have. And so in any way that we can appreciate birds and develop relationships with them, I think it then moves us towards that next place from appreciation to conservation, hopefully. And we aren't losing billions and not appreciating what they are.
Actually, there's a question from Robert Rivard about, can you guys tell us if it is true, and I think I've addressed this partially, that we're experiencing massive bird die-offs globally, and if so, why is that happening right now, and can the trend be reversed?
Yeah, the answer is absolutely that's happening right now. 2 years ago, a team of the top ornithologists in North America released a paper where they calculated that North America's lost about a third of its birds in the last 40 or 50 years, almost 3 billion birds, migratory and resident alike. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. We've dramatically altered the landscape. We've altered the climate. Many of the birds that are in the steepest decline feed on insects, and we're in the middle of an insect apocalypse on a global scale right now. Can it be reversed? Yeah, I mean, I think at my core, I'm a fairly optimistic person. It's a huge challenge, but that same paper that pointed out that we've lost 3 billion birds also pointed out that some groups of birds are doing really, really well in North America, like waterfowl and marsh birds and wading birds. And the reason for that is simply because starting, especially in the 1980s, we started as a society to devoting enormous amount of money and a lot of political will and focused attention on restoring and protecting wetland habitats. And with many birds, grassland birds in particular, which are the group in the worst trouble, if we did the same thing for grassland habitat, we would be able to bring those birds back in a significant way. So yeah, we're losing a lot, but it's not hopeless.
Okay, well, I think we have time for one more question. Diane Lambert wants to know, do migratory birds sleep in flight?
I can tackle that one. Yes, they do, but they do it not in the same way we do. They do it by turning one half of their brain off at a time and alternating back and forth. It's called unihemispheric sleep. So the one hemisphere and the associated eye go on and off and on and off about in some cases about every 12 seconds or so. So they're like little half brain micro naps. And consequently, you can get a bird that can stay awake or can stay aloft, for 10 months at a time, like swifts in Africa, European swifts in Africa.
Is there any chance for that to humans? Learn how to do that?
We do it.
Yeah.
It's the thing. There was just in the last few years, there was a study that found that with sleep studies of humans, often they threw out the first night of data because it always was kind of garbled and weird. Well, it turned out because the first night you sleep in a new place, you actually practice a form of unihemispheric sleeping. You always wonder why when you go to a new place, you have a rough night that first time. It's because half your brain is kind of sleeping with one eye open a little bit because you're very vulnerable when you're sleeping. So your body is trying to sort of assess and make sure that this is a safe place to be. And there are other mammals that do this. Dolphins famously do it.
Right.
So this is an ability that we share with birds, which God knows. I mean, if this could be something we share back from 300 million years ago, or we might have evolved it independently.
Well, thank you to all of you for being here today. Your books are amazing. We've got World on the Wing by Scott Weidensaul, Most Remarkable Creature by Jonathan Meiburg, and Sparrow NB by J. Lantham. Encourage you all to go to Nowhere Books. There's a link here somewhere on the website. You can buy them directly from this independent bookstore in San Antonio, Texas that supports the book festival, or at your local bookstore, wherever you happen to be. So thank you everyone for coming today. Thank you all in the audience for joining us, and enjoy your bird spotting and have a good weekend.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Scott. Such a pleasure to meet everybody.
Good enough.
Absolutely. Good birding, everyone.
Thanks.